Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome back. If you're new to the show or if this is your first time tuning in, welcome. Super excited to have you. I have a wonderful show planned for today. It's a show that I have definitely been working on for a long time because this topic interested me. I became very interested in this topic quite some time ago. And so I wanted to definitely get an expert here to talk with us about it. And this show really just, brought to life a lot of awareness. So the guest I have on the show today is Dr. Amy Baker, licensed psychologist. She is an expert in parental alienation. She's going to be talking with us about personality disorder parenting, what that looks like, how that shows up in high conflict divorces and custody battles, and how parental alienation comes about and what we can do about it as a result of those high conflict custody battles with parents that likely show some strong personality disorder traits. And she talks about, some of the, just some of the struggles, both short term and long term, that children who are caught in the middle experience as a result of parental alienation. And I think, if any of my listeners out there are going through a divorce or have been through a divorce, or their children have been kept from them, or perhaps you might even be a parent where on the other side of it, where that the other parent is talking badly about you to your children, or trying to keep your children away from you, or manipulating your children into thinking you're a bad person, then hopefully this episode will really resonate with you. And so I love how Dr. Baker eloquently broke down the definition of parental alienation and, gave some tips on how to handle it if it does become an issue for you. So without further ado, here's my interview with Dr. Amy Baker. Hello and welcome to the show, Amy.
Happy to be here.
Great. Without further ado, can you please tell the listeners, if they're not familiar with you, who you are, what you do, and the passion behind your work?
Sure. So I have a PhD in developmental psychology. So I'm technically a doctor, but I'm happy to be called Amy. I much prefer that. So my PhD is in developmental psychology. I'm primarily a researcher. So I conduct studies and then I write up the findings in articles and books. I have about 130 peer-reviewed journal articles and I think 8 or 9 books. My real passion is generally child maltreatment, protecting children, helping parents do better. Specifically, I focus a lot on parental alienation, children caught up in the conflict of their parents and what happens to those kids, and how to help parents be as effective as they can in that situation.
I love it. Can you talk a little bit about what sort of led you to be passionate about that particular area of research?
Well, it's hard to, I've been doing this. My first book came out in 2007. So that first research study which kind of launched me into parental alienation. That started back in 2005. And it, to me at the time, it was another form of child maltreatment and I'm interested in all forms of child maltreatment, but I really had an intense experience. The first time I gave a book talk, I think it was at a library somewhere, and there's like 100 people in the audience, and this person came up to me, clutching my book to her, to her heart, and she said something like, "Page 153 changed my life." And I've been doing research for 20 years already at that point, and I'd never had that experience where somebody said to me, "This study you did moved me, helped me, is going to make a difference in the here and now." And so, of course, that led me to think about, well, what else could I do in this field? And then that led to another study or another book or another workshop. And it's not that often as a researcher in the social sciences where there's an audience of people hungry to learn about something that you're studying. And so it's not that I set out 20 years ago to make this my life, but the parents who were dealing with it, they made me make this my life. They demanded it of me and wanted it and appreciate, I think, what I have to offer. So it's just been, it sort of just took on a life of its own.
I love that. And, parental alienation hasn't always been a common term, and I know that a lot of people use it now, especially when it comes to high conflict divorce and child custody types of things. So for people that may not know, can you tell us a little bit about what parental alienation is and how it impacts maybe both parents and children?
So it's true. The problem has been around probably, dating back to like the Bible, like we're talking about. It is a problem that is pervasive, widespread, longstanding, but the term didn't really come into our parlance originally back in 1985, and it still is not widely recognized as a term. But then when you describe it to people, they're like, "Oh yeah, of course." So parental alienation, loosely defined, is a family dynamic in which one parent engages in behaviors that can foster the child's unjustified rejection of the other parent. So there's alienation on the part of a parent. Those are the 17 primary parental alienation strategies. The parent engages in many of those behaviors, and then that can induce alienation in the child.
Okay. So can you break that down for the layperson that may not quite get what you're saying?
Yeah. So often in divorce, but could still be in a marriage that's intact, one parent will do or say things that conveys to the child that the other parent is unsafe, unloving, and unavailable. They don't necessarily have to say it like, "Oh, you think your mom's great? She never loved you." Or, "Oh, you think your dad's a good guy? He's really dangerous." It's not necessarily as overt as that. And in fact, there are 17 behaviors that a parent could engage in that could result in the child over time coming to feel that that other parent isn't really safe, isn't really available, doesn't really love them. And when that happens, when the child adopts that manufactured feeling and thought, the child then is said to be alienated. They then become rejecting of a parent who does not deserve to be rejected. And I want to be clear, not every time a child rejects a parent is it alienation. If a parent beat or molested a child or was never there or whatever, seriously deficient as a parent, and that child eventually says, "I can't take this anymore. I don't want a relationship, or I need to set boundaries," or whatever. That is not alienation. It's only alienation when the favored parent engaged in those behaviors and the child's rejection is unjustified.
And you said though there's 17 sort of hallmark behaviors. What are those 17 hallmark behaviors that you've observed and studied about?
Yeah, and it really does come from the research. So I started by interviewing 40 adults who lived through this. And I said, well, what did mom do to convince you that your dad, which you're telling me was a pretty good guy, had to be rejected? Or what did dad do over time that led you to never talk to your mom again? And then I interviewed parents who were going through this. What do you think the other parent is doing to turn your child against you? So I had the kid perspective, the parent perspective, and then I created a measure that's now used all around the world studying exposure to alienation. So the 17 behaviors, and I'm not going to remember all of them,
Okay.
probably not. So there's, the easiest one to know about is bad mouthing or denigrating. So those are making, false and untrue statements about the other parent, interfering in that other parent's parenting time. So not producing the child when they're supposed to, or coming early, picking up the child early, dropping the child off late, or just not producing the child at all, interfering in communication, not, basically hanging up the phone when that parent calls, not giving that parent the cell phone number of the kids, etc. Something that I call interfering in symbolic communication, which basically means making it hard for the child to look at pictures of the other parent, or think about the other parent, or talk about the other parent. So it's sort of almost like that other parent does not exist when the child is with the favored parent who's engaging in these behaviors. Asking the child to keep secrets from the other parent, asking the child to spy on the other parent, referring to the child by a different name, referring to that other parent by first name. So instead of like, oh, dad's on the phone, it's, John is called. I know that might seem innocuous, but it's actually very, very powerful. Not sharing information with the parent that they would need in order to function and be a good parent, referring to somebody else as mom or dad instead of like stepmom, stepdad, etc. I know those aren't all 17, but that's the gist of it. It's a set of behaviors that might seem sort of like, oh, that's over there, and this is over here, and this is, but they're actually part of a pattern of behavior that, taken together, incite conflict between the child and the other parent, incite distance in that relationship, create a feeling of cohesion between the child and the parent who's doing this, so that eventually the child will cut off that other parent.
It's essentially triangulation, it sounds like, where you're just sort of having having the child align, or children align with one parent and forcing the other one out.
So, so there's different kinds of alignments. And so alienation is one kind of alignment. So a child might prefer one parent, but still have a relationship with the other parent, and you might say they're aligned. Or a child could be aligned with the parent because the other parent is abusive. So alienation is one specific kind of alignment, just like it's one kind of triangulation, because you could have triangulation where both parents are pulling on the kid and the kid sort of flip-flopping back and forth, right? This is a triangulation where the child is brought into the conflict by one parent to be aligned with that one parent against that other parent.
Can you talk a little bit about why the parent is doing that? What are some of the reasons that you found that parents do that?
So we have a lot of speculation and sort of clinical wisdom that's been accumulated over the years. There's very little actual research, because nobody admits to being an alienating parent, right? Like if I'm seeking 100 alienating parents to interview, I would get 0 people, signing up to be part of a research study. But based on my interviews with adults who have lived through this, and based on the wisdom accumulated from custody evaluators who do have access to both parents, and of course talking to the parents who are going through it, there's a consensus in the field that parents who engage in alienation have some form of personality disorder, whether it's narcissism, borderline, or social antisocial. They go together in what used to be called a cluster B personality disorder. And my thinking about why that's the case is what those three have. They have a couple of things in common, those 3 personality disorders. And one of them is kind of an overconfidence in your sense of rightness. So whether it's a borderline being certain that they're being abandoned, or a narcissist certain that they've been insulted, or a sociopath certain that he's entitled to not follow the laws, whatever the belief is, there's almost an imperviousness to feedback. Right? So if you said to an alienator, you know, what you're doing is harming your child, I don't think they would believe you. If you said, I know for a fact that your child will be angry at you later, which I don't know, by the way. It is not always the case that the kid grows up and says, oh, I can't believe that happened to me. But even if I knew that were the case, and I said that to an alienator, I have no reason to believe they would say, oh, thank you, because they give ultimate stock in what they believe to be true. So that's one element that the three personality disorders have in common. The other is a difficulty in appreciating an alternative perspective. So let's say I'm a woman, let's say I'm a narcissist, let's say I divorce my husband, I then devalue him, he's garbage, he's no good, I do that to shore myself up and feel better. I'm going to have, if I'm a narcissist, a very hard time appreciating that the kids might still have value in that relationship, that they might have a different experience. Not great husband, but still be a good dad. The kids have their own needs separate from my need. That is where people with cluster B personality disorders have a very hard time. It's like, I think that person's bad, so everybody knows that person is bad. Why would my kids have any benefit in having a relationship with that person? That's just, some of the ways in which personality disorders kind of create a platform for alienation. But we don't know that every narcissist is an alienator. We don't know if every alienator is a narcissist. And when I'm coaching parents on this very point, like they want to go before the judge or talk to their lawyer or the kid's therapist or an evaluator, and I know she's a borderline, I know he's a narcissist. I generally advise people to stay away from labels and talk about the behavior. What is that other person doing that's a problem for you, or you think is a problem for the kids? Because people don't lose custody based on having a personality disorder. They lose custody based on their behavior. So to some extent, the label is not that helpful.
I would agree with that. And what, based on what you can prove, especially when it comes to court, being that you've researched and studied this quite extensively, in your opinion, is one parent, for example, are mothers or fathers, like, which one is more at a disadvantage when it comes to parental alienation? Do you, in your research, have you found that one sort of outweighs the other?
So historically, when Richard Gardner first coined the term parental alienation, he believed that mothers were doing it, like, out of every 100 cases, it was, 90% was going to be mothers. And I don't know that that's true. That was anecdotal. But that was a long time ago, when mothers were more likely to have custody and feel entitled to custody and have a sense of proprietary ownership over the kids that might have resulted in them engaging in alienation. The world is a very different now. And even over time, Richard Gardner said, you know what? Both parents are doing this. Men can do it. Women can do it. It can happen. I don't know if Gardner said this, but I certainly know it can happen in same gender marriages. So the expert consensus at this point is it's absolutely can be done by anybody, even non-custodial parents. So there used to be this idea that, like, well, if you had your kids, 65% of the time, the other parent wouldn't have the kids enough to be able to influence them against you. And that's not true either. So this might be a little bit of a digression, but in terms of, like, who's more or less, who has the advantage, certainly when it comes to court, my belief, my experience, and I've been an expert witness in
Yeah.
cases all over the country. I've talked to thousands and thousands of parents. The
Absolutely.
court favors the favored parent. Now, some judges have a bias. They're not supposed to, but it's possible a judge might think, oh, that poor dad, he just wants to see his kid. Let's give him more custody. It's possible, or mothers deserve custody. But in general, if there's already alienation and a child is aligned with one parent, hostilely rejecting the other parent without a good reason, the court will still support, in general, not every case, but in general, the support of the court goes for the parent that the child is already favoring. So,
What, in your opinion, why is that?
I think that judges are risk averse. And when I'm unkind, I would say they're lazy cowards. When I'm kind, I say they're risk averse. They're very fearful of making a child spend time with the parent that the child says they don't want to be with. I think they're afraid that they will do that and the child will kill themselves. It's probably happened once over the last 50 years. You know, I don't really know personally of any cases, but I think that in general, the court supports the status quo. So whoever has the kid and whoever has the kid saying that the kid wants to be with that parent, that is the parent that the courts are generally going to side with. Again, not every time. It's possible to go to court and educate the judge about what is alienation and why the court should not follow the preference of the child. But that is much harder to do than for the court to just say, look, the kid wants to be with mom. The kid's already 15. Mom says mom says she's trying to get the kid to have a relationship with the other parent. She can't be that bad. Let's just leave it the way it is.
You know, one of the things struck me as you were talking is I'm often wondering about the child or children that are in the middle of this. In your experience, do they have the insight to understand what's actually going on? Are children usually aware that they're being manipulated, or would you say that widely varies? Or
well, it does vary, but in general, nobody's aware they're being manipulated. I mean, there's research that shows that most people think advertising doesn't work. It's like, really? Why do you think Coca-Cola spends $1 million a year in advertising? Right? I mean, there's plenty of research that shows that we're highly susceptible to the packaging or the music that's playing in the supermarket while we're, that's sort of hypnotizing us. There's all sorts of ways that people can be unduly influenced. A great example of that is manipulating people through the principle of scarcity, which is the feeling that if something is scarce, it must be valuable. So research shows that you can put a stack of Campbell soup cans, some soup, doesn't matter the brand, cans of, beans, soup, whatever, in a supermarket. And if you have a sign that says limited 12, people will buy 12. They don't need 12 cans of whatever it is. Most people aren't stockpiling, but they can be only 12. That's what it says. Limit 12. People feel
we found that out. We found that out during COVID for sure. If nothing else, we definitely found that out during COVID with toilet paper and everything else.
Right. But people were coming from a legitimate fear then. I'm saying no pandemic, no need to stockpile, and people will still buy something if they think it's scarce, even though it's not scarce and they don't need it. So most people are susceptible to influence. Oh, there's so many different kinds of ways to persuade people to do things outside of their conscious awareness. Most kids are not aware. Sometimes the alienator is so inartful that it backfires. It's so obviously ridiculous, or that parent is so terrible to the kid that the kid's like, I'm not buying that. This parent doesn't treat me well. Now they're bad mouthing the other parent. But many times the kids are manipulated. They are pressured. They're not aware of it. Even teenagers. There used to be this idea of like, well, once kids get to be a certain age, they're very savvy. They know which parent is the better parent. And that's why most states have a law that says that kids have a right to have a preference as to which parent they want to be with. once they reach a certain age. In some states, it's 12, which is ridiculous. But the truth
Yeah.
is, all children, meaning 18 and under, are susceptible to undue influence because their prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed, whereas their amygdala is really sort of running the show. And the amygdala is where it's the sort of the seat of sort of gut reaction,
Yes.
emotional decision making, which of course is why teens are likely to get into drugs and be, have unsafe sex, etc. So I don't know why the courts think kids aren't, kids are old enough, a 12-year-old's old enough to pick a parent, but they're not old enough to vote, get married, drink, drop out of school, not wear seatbelts, etc. Right? There's lots of things society has said, this is so important, we're not leaving it up to individuals, and we're not going to let kids decide. But
Mhm.
somehow every state has a law that says kids have a right to have a say in which parent they live with. It doesn't take into account that some kids are being manipulated, so their preference is false. It's not really what's best for them.
And I totally agree with that. And I would even add that, just being asked to choose between a parent in and of itself, like, you automatically may make one feel bad. I feel like just being asked to choose which parent do you want to live with, which parent do you feel like is better. I mean, just being asked that, unless there's like a serious like abuse situation or something else. But
We don't
it
ask
both,
abused kids. We just pull abused kids out of the home. We don't ask
yeah,
them. Most abused kids would rather be with the abuser. That is
yeah,
also well established.
yep,
We don't even ask them. Why would we ask somebody who has two, competent parents? And it invites the parents to compete for the
yes,
kid, to, entice the child, blackmail the child, manipulate the child, etc. And that's not good for kids. Oh, you don't have to go to that parent's house. They, you know, let's say dad says to the child, you need to clean your room. And then the kid calls mom, dad's being mean. Oh, I'll pick you up, honey. And then that kid never learns, like they have to
mm,
clean their room and they have to listen to authority sometimes. It really warps these kids. They can be very over entitled, over empowered.
yeah,
And that is not, how are they going to get along in a job? They don't know how to like respect authority. And I don't believe in blind obedience at all, but there's some minimum respect for other people that parents, in my opinion, should be encouraging their children to adopt, but alienating parents are doing the opposite. I don't care if your mother, worked really hard to have this sweet 16 party for you. If you don't like her, tell her not to come to the party, right? How is that good for a child's moral development?
mm. Let me ask you, so you're saying that, and I understandably so, that children don't necessarily have the insight, but what about as you become an adult and you were the child in the midst of this? Because you said you had studied over time adults and things like that, do you feel like they sort of develop the insight and awareness as they get older, or do you feel like they're still sort of in that triangle even then and still being manipulated, so to speak?
Yeah, and that's really the main question that was the driver for my first study, because I think when I first started getting interested in this topic and I went on a couple internet support groups, whatever, really the main question that every parent had is, am I going to get my kid back? Right? Like, should I just keep hanging on and one day they're going to come back to me? And so I really wanted to talk to people. I wanted to see, would anybody even respond to a flyer that said, when you were a child, did one parent turn you against the other parent? And yeah, that was, thankfully, that was not that hard to find 40 people like that. And then what I asked them, the heart of the interview that I did with them and the heart of the book is, how did you come to that realization? And
Mm,
for most of them, it was not an epiphany. One or two had these incredibly poignant, powerful moments where literally the sun is shining and it caught a tear on the parent's cheek, and the kid said, "Oh my God, my parent does care." I mean, it was like this beautiful moment where like the clouds parted and the sun literally it glistened off the tear on his cheekbone, and the kid had an epiphany. For most of them, it was a slow process over the course of time in which they began to question, maybe the story I've been given, maybe the narrative isn't the whole story. And in the book, I identified, I think it's 12 catalysts to the realization process. So for one person, it was going into therapy, not to deal with this, to deal with something else. And then the therapist sort of wisely, helped the person rethink. For some of them, it was having a baby, and it's like, wow, I want my baby to have two parents. How come my mom or dad didn't want that for me? For some of them, it was having a significant other say, I've heard a lot of stories about that, Dad. Why don't we check it out for ourselves? You're a grown up now. Whatever. There were 12 catalysts. And the really good news is that now we have a 13th catalyst, which is all the help that targeted parents can get as they are living this. I mean, I have plenty of clients whose kids are like 1, 2, 3, well, like very young. And with the right legal support, the right mental health support, the right coaching, these people are, many of them have, I can say, succeeded. Hopefully more and more will, so that we don't have to wait till they're adults and the person to say, or to get married or to have a kid or go into therapy and then figure it out. The goal really is to intervene as soon as we can so that we can disrupt the alienation.
For the parent that is actually alienated, to go through this experience, I'm sure does a mental number on them that no one can really understand the scope of the pain that it causes. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and if they're able to, or how they're able to repair their relationship with their child.
So the good news is, if you type in, I think my child's being turned against me, or some version of that, they're going to find a lot of information and support. I mean, I alone have written 8 books on maybe 9, whatever. Most of them are on the topic of alienation. One is the story of adults who lived through it. One is the story of parents who got their kids back. One is a workbook for kids. One is whatever. So there's lots and lots of support, and all that support helps the parents feel less alone, less isolated, less shameful. Oh, nobody's going to think at this point I'm the only person this is happening to. And all of that helps them. Plus, there's so much we have learned about how these parents should be interacting with their kids, with their ex, with the therapist, with the judge, with their lawyer, with the custody evaluator, the GAL, the attorney for the child, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All those people, to avoid what I will just sort of loosely call taking the bait. And taking the bait means doing something that inadvertently reinforces the lie. Right? The lie is that you're unsafe, you're unloving, and unavailable. And there's a lot of ways that targeted parents can inadvertently reinforce the lie. They can get angry if their kid calls them, Shirley instead of mom, right? Or, hey, John, I don't really want to go out for ice cream now. And the kid is sort of snarky and, calling the dad by his first name. And if that dad responds with anger or despair or, what do you mean? Why are you calling me that? Did your other parent tell you to do that? Why are you that? All the things of human nature would just sort of dictate that if somebody accuses us of something we didn't do, we would say, what are you talking about? That didn't happen. Or your kid's being arrogant, you would say, don't be so rude, or that's nasty, or whatever. All those sort of typical things that parents do in this situation don't work. they actually make things worse.
Mm.
So I can speak for myself. All my coaching is really about helping parents maintain the attachment that they have and hopefully prevent them from taking the bait and doing something that then everybody points to as the reason the child's rejecting them. And then that makes it harder for anybody in the legal system to intervene, because now the rejected parent's behaving badly, so now it looks like they deserve to be rejected.
And this might be an unpopular question for some of my listeners, but I'm just thinking as you're talking, like, man, this is really an uphill battle for the parent that's alienated, right? You're talking about someone who is literally fighting every day just to really even have a relationship, the basic right to have a relationship with their child. But not only that, to have a regular life outside of that too, right? Have an income that's not being poured into court or being poured into trying to do this. Is it sometimes better just to walk away from it?
I think it depends on what walk away means. I never think it's better to write like a goodbye letter. That's it, son. I've decided I need to sort of cut my losses, go have a great life. I'll be here one day if you decide to come back. I don't know what the value of that is, except to provide the parent with some kind of false sense of closure. Because I would imagine that anybody who wrote that letter every single day still misses their kid and still, pines for them and wishes there was something to do. I do think you don't have to go to court. There are situations where it doesn't make sense. I mean, generally what I say is if your kids are 2 and you're a millionaire and the date is on your side, go to court. If your kids are 17 and you're broke and you don't have good evidence, don't go to court. Don't bother. You're going to just drain yourself of emotional and financial resources, aggravate everybody, and there's no good will come out of it. No court's going to make a 17 or 17 and a half year old spend time with the parent they don't want to, and the other parent can just run out the clock. Most people are in the middle. Their kids are over 2, and they have some money, but not everybody's a millionaire. And they have to try to figure out for themselves, does it make sense to go to court? And that's sort of a yes, no. And there's that's a big part of my coaching, is helping people figure out specifically for them, what's the likelihood they would win? What are they asking for? What does winning mean, etc. But even if, for whatever reason, you decide you're not going to go to court, you're not going to file a motion, you're not going to try to get the court to intervene and make your kid be with you or get the kind of treatment you think would help, you can still reach out to your child every day and send them a text of love, a text of connection. You could get a little help on what to do if your child, does respond, but it's angry. How do you manage that? I don't see a need to absolutely walk away unless your child says, I will kill myself if you text me again. I think you have to take that seriously. And of course, if there's a restraining order, you have to take that seriously. But otherwise, if you know how to send an appropriate kind of message, and I'm actually writing a book with 380 types of messages you can send to your child, because a lot of parents get stuck and don't know how to do it and what to do if you get this kind of response back, and lots of do's and don'ts about how to do it. But if you can do it, even though it's painful, because every time you send a message, you get your hopes up a little bit, and then you feel kind of disappointed when you don't get a response. But if you can manage it, that is generally what I recommend. There might be some specific situation where it wouldn't be a good idea, but I don't think there's any point in writing some kind of goodbye letter or simply stopping altogether. You're just reinforcing that you're unsafe, unloving, and unavailable. That's what I just want to be clear that there could be some specific situation. I don't want people to take my advice thinking that it applies necessarily to them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'll definitely put a disclaimer on the show
Yeah.
because every situation is very different. But I still really appreciate you saying that because I know that there's probably people that are listening to this, that this has been the most challenging thing. And,
I'd
you
like to
know,
offer can I just offer um,
yeah,
a, a metaphor that might be helpful?
yeah, go ahead.
So if you send a text every day to your child, is any one text necessarily going to make a difference? I mean, you don't know, right? You don't know which one, which good morning, or I'm looking up at the sun and it's the same sun that's shining down on both of you and I'm thinking of you. You know, you don't know what message is going to work. But I think of every message as a grain of sand. And I
Hmm.
think about it that way for two reasons. One, if you think of a scale, right, like right now, everything is tipped toward the favored parent. No one grain of sand is going to bring it back, but the accumulation could. The weight of your continued efforts to show your child that you love them in and of itself has meaning, even if the child isn't reading the message. They might just see that string of, oh, another message, another message, another message. That can have meaning in and of itself. And the other is, no one grain of sand can make a beach, but all of them together make something, beautiful and powerful, magnificent, right? But it's no one grain. It's the accumulation of
I like that. I like that. So you're talking a lot more about, just the consistency over time they will see.
them.
And,
They may
they
see,
may
right? Because
see.
we don't know. I really try not to promise, but I think you're doing what you can. You are messaging, literally, you're sending a message, but also more generally, you're messaging to your child that you love them, that you are still there for them when they are ready and able to open their heart to you.
I like that. Um, Long term, what are the effects that you see on children that go through this as adults? What what sort of behaviors or dynamics may develop in their own interpersonal relationships when they grow up and become adults? And, even with the parent that is, coercing them into the manipulation or the alienation. Is there any sort of dynamics that really stand out to you?
Well, in terms of the long-term effects, that's something I spent a lot of time researching. That was actually picked up in my first book, where I talked to people and I asked them, what did this do to you? And then I followed it up with more systematic research. And I would say, I'm happy to rattle off the effects, but they're not necessarily all true for every person, right? So let's say
Sure.
10 possible, and I'm just coming up with a number, a certain number of negative things that are associated with having been turned against a parent by the other parent, but it certainly doesn't mean that any one person will experience all of them. So it's helpful to think of exposure to alienation as a risk factor for lots and lots of bad outcomes. Depression, because they felt so guilty when these people realized what had happened to them and what they had done to that other parent. They ended up feeling very ashamed of themselves for having hurt a parent and sad for the time that they lost. They suffered from low self-esteem because they felt like, oh, what a fool I am. How could I be so stupid? They had issues trusting people, right? If my mother told me that dad was so bad and then it turned out she was not so good and dad was okay and I believed her, how can I trust anybody again? So that sort of thing. Anxiety, a lot of stress and pressure on them to always be managing their situation, and that carries with them. And some of them ended up marrying people that were just like the alienator, whether it's a narcissist or borderline, and then they got divorced and then they lost their kids. So there's an intergenerational component to it.
Mhm.
And then there was a subset for whom the alienating parent didn't just turn them against the other parent, but really constrained their development in the same way that a cult leader does, right? If you're part of a cult, you're not like getting your law degree and, having friends and all sorts of experiences and right, like, functioning in the real world with jobs and whatever. So the alienators who were like that wanted the kids to go, they didn't get to go away to college. They didn't shine in high school. They didn't have professional careers. They were dependent on the alienator well into their own, adult life. So those are some of the outcomes. It's not a small thing to be turned against a parent by the other parent. It affected how they felt about themselves, their bodies, their faces. It affected how they feel about other people. It affected how they felt about the world. It's a profound experience.
One of the things that I wonder about as you're talking about is the external environment, like extended family and friends and people that are kind of in the network that are on the outside that see everything that's going on.
I think it's hard sometimes for people on the outside to see it because the alienating parent, if they're artful, present really well. They're charming, they're attractive, they say all the right things. Oh, I want little Jimmy and Johnny to spend time with their mom. I encourage them. What else can I do? And people are, wow, what a great dad. He really is trying. So they can fool a lot of people, even the judge, even, the mediators and whatever. Just a random story, a mom was telling me that the dad had scheduled like a 2-week vacation with the kid without telling her on her parenting time. And that was one of many things that came into the mediation, room. And the mediator was like, oh, what a great dad to take his kid on vacation. Like completely overlooking that he had just robbed the mother of her parenting time. To him, that was what, that looked like being a great dad. Maybe his dad didn't take him on something like that. And so that's what he brought to it. So these alienators are good at faking normal. They're good at faking sincerity. They're good at faking concern for the other parent. So it's hard. They can mislead people. And then the targeted parent is anxious, agitated, angry. They have an agenda. They want everybody to see that it's alienation, and all that negative energy backfires. They look like the problem. The alienator, calm, cool, and collected, looks like they're, the greatest thing, around.
Wow. So this is it. They really do a good job from what I'm hearing. But even if they do the great job of sort of saying that they're this or they're that and that they're trying, how can one from the outside looking in, how do you sort of justify, hey, they're keeping the children from them permanently? Does that make sense?
I don't think anybody says they're doing it permanently, right?
Or they're attempting to block them from seeing their children at all.
But that's not what they say. Most alienators say, look, I want the kids. They're so old. What am I going to do? Strap them to the roof of the car? I can't make them go. I don't want them to hate the other. I could punish them, but then they would hate that other parent and resent them. Now, to me, I have thought about that issue enough that one of the things I can do is help a lawyer cross-examine that person on the stand and reveal, I think you are sensing there's some kind of hypocrisy there. You would basically ask, like, do you make your children take their vitamins every day? Okay. Do you make your children do their homework? Okay. Do your children go to school every day? Okay. And it's like, so the one thing you can't get them to do is go to their dads. What would you do if they didn't take their vitamin every day? What would you do? What would you do if your kids didn't want to wear a seatbelt? And you can sort of show that saying, I encourage my kids to spend time with that other parent, they think is clever because they think they're saying, hey, I'm doing everything I can. But to me, The word encourage implies that it's optional. We don't encourage our kids to go to school. We drive them to school every day. We don't
Mm,
encourage them to wear their seatbelts. We don't drive until their seatbelt is buckled. So by saying encourage, the parent is actually revealing that they are treating something that is a court order, mandatory thing as optional. And simply by signaling to the children, I'm encouraging you to do something, is saying your preference is more important than a court order when it comes to seeing that other parent, not when it comes to anything else. But a lot of people are fooled by that. They think, oh, she's so great, or he's so great. He says he's encouraging, and they just sort of leave it at that.
wow. Wow. So this is definitely a multi-layered, very complicated issue, which, I already know that, but it just seems like there's just so many elements that add to it, that make it that much more painful. And I appreciate you breaking it down. We're out of time, but gosh, I really learned so much from you. You really gave a lot of insights here, and I appreciate that. It's one of the things I appreciate about doing this, and having wonderful guests such as yourself come on and talk about this, because I don't think people are aware of the magnitude unless you're in it,
Yeah.
unless you're in it and you've been through it. But if you're kind of explaining it to somebody that has never been through it, you're gonna, like you said, people don't necessarily believe it because that other parent has done such a good job, or whatever the case may be. So I appreciate you being able to eloquently break it down for the layperson. um, Tell us about you, how people can find you, if you're doing any sort of fabulous work that we can support you with.
Well, I have a website, which is just my name, amyjlbaker.com. And a little bit about each of my books is there. I have a blog, whatever, sort of standard stuff. But I do offer telephone coaching. The only service that I provide at this point, I used to do expert witness services. I'm not taking on any new cases, but I
Yeah.
do offer coaching, individual sessions. It's not therapy. It's short term focus. My kid said this. What do I do? My kid tried that, or my ex wife sent me this text. How do I handle it? So I just try to help people kind of navigate the situation, think big picture about their legal strategies. Sometimes I meet with people and their lawyer to make sure that the client is asking all the right questions of the lawyer, which they don't even know they need to be asking. So that's it. If anybody wants to know about my coaching, they can go to the coaching page of my website and follow the steps and set up a session.
Absolutely. And I'll be sure to put this in the show notes so people can easily find that as well.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
Okay. Love to know what your thoughts were. Would love to continue this conversation on social media. And the links are down in the show notes. So I hope that you, check us out on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. And let us know what your thoughts are. Let me know if this show really resonated with you. And until next time, you guys take care of yourselves, stay out of trouble, and be well. Bye-bye. Check out the sneak preview of next week's episode.
I think that, like, reflecting back on it now, I learned how to be vulnerable because you have to be. Like, you don't have any choice but to be vulnerable. Especially with past relationships, I feel like I'm very defensive and like I have this guard up and I just don't like to open up to people. So my time on the show, like, forced vulnerability, forced communication, because that's the premise of getting to know someone and opening up and feeling like you're in a safe place. And I think I've learned a lot about how to just be more in touch with my vulnerability and open up to people and be genuine.